Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about the road forward for CIOs in the post-COVID world. We'll talk about what changed temporarily and what's been changed forever by the pandemic, and we'll discuss how digital transformation is redefining the working world. To discuss all that, I'm joined by four major thought leaders. With me is Paige Francis, Chief Information Officer at the University of Tulsa and author of Demystifying IT, a pocket guide for the non-technical. Paige, your CIO and an author.
Well, primarily a CIO, author for fun. Just got these thoughts going. I got to get them out somewhere.
Ashley, okay, that sounds good. Also with me is Miles Sewer, Director of Solution Marketing at Elation and CIO chat facilitator and eWEEK contributor. Miles, you definitely stay busy yourself.
Just as busy as you are now.
Well, we hope. Let's see. Also with me is Isaac Sokolik, former Business Week CIO, author, and top 100 Chief Information Officer. And Isaac, I see your book in the background, Driving Digital. So you're an author as well?
I'm an author and also a writer and a speaker, and just like helping leaders execute transformation.
Great. And rounding out our panel is Jason James, Chief Information Officer at NetHealth and a winner of many awards. Jason has had the list, and I couldn't really, memorize them all, but there's a lot of awards there.
I appreciate the feedback. And I, too, am writing my first book. I don't have it published, but hopefully the next time we meet next year, it'll be behind me, much like Isaac has done.
I like that. I like the whole book in the background thing.
Right?
You've got some tiki art in the background. Like, give me the lowdown on the tiki art, if you could.
So one of my weird hobbies is I'm a big tiki enthusiast. And so this tiki culture is the original staycation, right? And so there's these mugs that have come about called Geeky Tikis, and they focus on tiki culture, everything from Marvel to DC to Golden Girls. And it's just something fun. I have to remind myself that I am working from home indefinitely.
Well, that sort of ties into our conversation. It's a great segue. I've got some great questions. Before I begin, I want to thank the people who are watching and listening. Thank you so much for showing up. Deb, Martin, thank you. We love you, for goodness sakes, and we want to hear from you. So use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Ask your question at any time. This is the internet. Let's all interact with one another. All right. So road ahead for the CIOs. Let's look backward for one moment. How has the last year crystallized and changed priorities for CIOs? Miles, it's been a real earthquake of a year, the last 12, 18 months. How has it changed priorities for CIOs as you see it?
I mean, I think that the biggest thing was that most were ready, but didn't know they were ready. But most came into this thinking, well, this is going to be a few weeks or a month from our discussions. And then just, suddenly discovered that this was a space-time continuum changer. So I think that has put us on a different path forward. And we're seeing, the consternations by CEOs, some saying you have to all come back, and some saying some of you don't have to. And it's just been massive. But these folks have been living it. So I think it'd be interesting to hear what they're thinking on this as well.
Indeed. Paige, I mean, you literally are a Chief Information Officer. I mean, how has it crystallized and changed your priorities over the past year or so?
I think that what it did for me, shockingly, is that it helped me really double down on some of the strategic objectives that we had in place prior to the pandemic happening. I mean, it really seems as if CIOs have been beating a pretty persistent drum for the past decade about the critical nature of technology, how foundational it is to everything that's done. And the pandemic proved that time and time again. And if you're not on a continuous improvement track for keeping up to date and current with your systems, it can bring an entire institution down. And I think that what it has done is not that I always want to be right? CIOs are definitely not like that. But, it's helped in the budget area. It's helped in the prioritization area. And, for me, it's just making sure that we continually refine what our next step should be for a very uncertain, unknown future, right? We think that we've experienced the worst of what could happen. This was definitely not on anyone's DR, BC bingo card. But we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So we just need to make sure that we're always able to pivot to whatever.
Yeah, I mean, something you said reminded me of that phrase that we often hear. Every company is a tech company. It's sort of like we can't just ignore that anymore. It's really critical. Isaac, what would you add in terms of how priorities have changed in the past year for CIOs?
Well, like Paige said, for some groups that were struggling to get budget or to get attention, their mindset should be never waste a good crisis and use this to draw attention to the things that are most important. I also know a lot of organizations that had to pull back, that, for a long time they were running well too many initiatives and strategies at the same time, and it was overwhelming to people. And, my advice to them was, pull back. Your teams are overwhelmed already. Working from home isn't going to be easy, and, start going top down and figuring out what's most important. Along that journey, I think a lot of companies figured out how to work digitally, more or less, for better or worse. I also think that for many companies, they figured out how important data and technology is for them running their businesses. And so now that we're coming out of COVID, I think there's just a lot of debate what the right operating model needs to look like, and what's the impact of, to customers, and what markets people have to go into, given some new opportunities and some new risks. And there's some risks with supply chain. So I think, I'm starting to call it digital transformation 2.0. I'm starting to
go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm starting to call it digital transformation 2.0 because it really is a reset in terms of how people are working and how they're using data and technology.
I mean, it almost sounds like there's really as many questions as that in this particular time period. We're really in a super transition right now. There's as many questions as there are answers. Jason, what do you see? How has this last year crystallized or changed priorities for chief information officers?
It really focused everything, right? We had to determine what was essential, and really boiled down to how did we maintain status quo in terms of how people were connected, how were they engaged. For so long we have been focused on the KPIs of our systems. How are our systems running? Now we pivoted towards this more humanistic form of IT approach. How are people running, right? Our productivity was off the chart. The problem with running in the red zone, you can only do it even with a vehicle for so long, right? The engine takes an enormous amount of strain. So does the human effort of it. And so what our metrics started looking at is, how do people work? When do they work? How long are they working? It didn't matter that they came on at 10 and disappeared for 2 hours throughout the day. What we learned were people working in a remote setting work differently. And make no mistake, working remotely during a pandemic is very different than working remotely, right? But it was important as we started to focus and look at tools. If we were rolling out a new tool, we wouldn't have the same kind of conference room meetings where we were looking at UAT, right? We were looking at newer technologies, and were they more frictionless than before, right? If you've got the normal stress of a pandemic, the stress of, educating kids at home, dealing with stress of, a possible virus, how do you roll out a tool that makes someone's life easier? And so starting to look at whether it be security tools, connectivity, conferencing, whatever it would be, a frictionless approach and a humanistic approach became more important than ever. And again, when we start to look at the future, and that future for many organizations is hybrid, how do people use those tools? Do those tools finally impact a user in a positive way? It's not just about the business outcome, but the human outcome.
But what does it mean, though, to have a humanistic approach specifically? How does a CIO?
It means you got to be a lot closer to users than ever before. It's not a top-down approach of rolling out that technology. It's going out and looking at your current metrics to determine how they work, when they work, what tools are using. Do those tools work? What we found during this pandemic, talking to a lot of CIOs, what they thought was a tool for communication maybe became a tool for something else. Look at how we use Slack. If a meeting could have been an email, many of those emails turned into Slacks. And what happened is people started using that Slack in different ways. What we found were these water cooler discussions that started form, these employee resource groups. people were using a technology that had been an enterprise tool to connect in a very different way. And in many cases, at many organizations, some of those connections didn't really have anything to do with the day-to-day operations. It might be, hey, I'm working from home. How do I help my kid with this math problem? We saw a lot of that spin up. We saw channels pop up where people were showing off their pets. This idea is, and when we found that, we didn't discourage that. We didn't become the CIO. We were like, that's good. Go with that. Keep doing that, right? Because as we start to connect, we realize we're managing not only packets, but people. And so we need to give them an opportunity to shine. We need to make sure that the technology is available for them, but we also need to look at how they're using that technology. And in some ways, much like that scenario, it evolved into what the original design was used for.
Paige, does that resonate with some of the changes you've seen in terms of that more humanistic angle, or how would you define that, or if that works into the strategy you've been using?
I mean, absolutely. I think that, what I've endlessly talked about pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and what I'll probably continue to speak on is just the importance of building relationships working in IT. And, I think I've heard so many different stories and individual CIOs that had issues in the early days of the pandemic. They experienced the majority of their issues because they didn't know their users. They had not developed those relationships and that trust. So something that did not come secondhand to them, or something that wasn't already established for them with their users, they had to rapidly execute on that before addressing any of the technology needs, right? And boy, did that waste time. And boy, did that lead to fumbling. And boy, did that put them right into the middle of June to be able to get anything done. And by then, wow, good luck procuring even one webcam, right? So they were needing to do so much work. And if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that if you don't know your users, if you don't understand how the whole business works and ties together like a giant puzzle, and you haven't threaded through all of that, how technology facilitates every square inch of it, then you have some work to do. And that needs to be your top priority. Hard stop.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we're talking about relationships, we're talking about technologies. Miles, what do you see? I mean, how has the last year changed the relationship of the CIO with the business? I mean, clearly the CIO is a leading decision maker, but what changed beyond that in your view?
You're on mute.
Or we don't hear you.
I'm sorry. I think
Yeah.
CIOs, unless they're no longer in the seat, have figured out how to have a closer relation. People get the value IT provides. Maybe they didn't. I mean, maybe they didn't use a lot of the tools at the top level, but the top level has had to learn how to use Zoom and a whole bunch of other things, collaboration tools and things like that. So I think the CIO is closer to the business than they've ever been, and they're now being asked, okay, so what should our business strategies be going forward? So I think it's been an opportunity, and the smart CIOs have figured out how to get closer and solve problems. And there's lots of problems that obviously need to get prioritized. But I think this has been a real opportunity, and those who've seized it, like the folks on this call, have really gotten to change their position in the organization.
Isaac, what do you see in terms of the relationship between the CIO with the business? Is that improved, not improved, or how do you see it as changed by the pandemic?
Well, I mean, CIOs by nature are problem solvers. A pandemic hits and there's a huge problem, and where is the C-suite going to turn to say, how are we going to reinvent our operations? And, if the CIO already has relationships with sales and marketing and operations and finance, they're probably already 4 or 5 steps ahead, and already implementing things before they're being asked to, and so, yes, it took weeks for some, months for others, to get over that initial hiccup of, can we run the business now that we're remotely? And then a lot of questions came up, right? How we're going to collaborate? How do we deal with certain people who are spending more time than they should collaborating versus others who are struggling with 4 kids at home and can't be on a meeting at a specific time, or a workflow that worked in the office because you got people in a room together and they figured things out. That doesn't really work well anymore when you're working remotely. So I think, the natural CIOs were problem solvers. The better ones had good relationships. They understood um, how end users were already using technologies and how processes were being done. And they came together and said, look, this is what we need to do next. And so then I think the C-suite recognized that, and I've heard from a number of CIOs saying, look, not only was I recognized, but they recognized the knock for the first time, or they recognized the help desk for the first time, because they realized all of a sudden the entire employee base is trying to get in over VPN into the network. And not everybody knows how to do it. Not everybody is set up to do it. Everybody has different equipment to do it. And even once you get in, it's like, okay, what do you do once you're inside? How do you do your job now that you have the equipment and the networking set up? And CIOs and their teams were there to help with that. So I think it's been a very seismic shift in terms of how people are thinking about technology and data. And that's what I hope happens over the next year and a half, is they continue to ask those questions. How do we use technology and data to our advantage?
One thing, James, just quickly to add on to what
Please.
Isaac said,
Mhm.
this group has told me, and I don't know if it's been a long time since this question's been asked, but they've gotten asked, how do we spend more to make it better? We know we need to be closer to our customers. We know we need to be closer to our employees. How do we spend more? And that's a new question now that the people really get the value IT provides.
Hmm. Interesting. Jason, yeah, from where you sit in the CIO seat, I mean, how has the relationship between yourself and the business changed? Is there a new power balance there?
I would say, number one, I was fortunate enough to have a really good spot to begin with, right? And that close relationship, not only with, my peers, but the CEO, the board, everything. What it enabled other CIOs to do is that it gave them a moment to shine, right?
Hmm.
People understood the importance of IT. If you were able to pivot quickly and still do your job, your business was still being able to generate revenue, it was because of your IT. It was not because your CIO had it in a business continuity plan, like Paige said, because nobody foresaw the entire world picking up and going home, right? It just wasn't in there. But what some CIOs like myself saw was the need for anyone to be able to work from anywhere securely, right? And it was able to take that baseline technology and evolve it for people to work. What that showed to the business that IT is more than just a partner and a vendor. Without them, our business might be over. And especially during a pandemic, we saw some businesses that did not pivot as quickly, and there was detrimental financial impact to those organizations that did not have strong technical leaders in place. I think what it gives us an opportunity is to go beyond the technology, move more into the people empowerment. The evolution of the CIO is evolved into a cultural change agent to show that how technology is used, how that technology can create new lines of business, not just empower the business we have, but to create those new lines. And now the CIOs, because they've won so much in the pandemic, now they have a seat within the board and a seat with the other executives to say, hey, let's try this.
Mhm. What about needing to digitally engage with employees and customers better, which is certainly a key part of handling the pandemic? Paige, what are some of the priorities and things that you're working on and proposing to improve this process?
Well, I think, the one we flat out over communicated, right? From
Okay.
the very beginning
That's a good
of,
thing, I
of
assume, right?
yes, from this
Yes.
pandemic. I think that as CIOs, we're successful CIOs because we can manage stress, right? At least on the outside. And we've been supporting technology, which moves at the pace of technology change, right? And so when the pandemic hit, we all just kicked into a normal gear, possibly a high gear, but we kicked into a normal gear and we were able to do things that appeared superhuman while still deploying a whole new physical core network, right? Like we still had to do our day-to-day stuff while facilitating, like for the University of Tulsa, we needed to make sure that we could do the basic function of delivering teaching and learning to thousands of people, right? By thousands of people. I think that from a communication perspective, what we need to make sure that we don't lose the habits that we've created over the past year, which is authentically communicating with our people, right? And keeping them in the loop and making sure that they felt like a part of the process. I mean, I have to be honest, I feel as if for the majority of my peers, beyond the fact that there's a deeper respect for technology, despite the fact that people are now listening to every word that we're saying, I feel as if I have won a war with my colleagues and my peers. Like there is a link there. And as a non-military person, right? Like I haven't necessarily felt this before, but I feel this real innate sense of pride at what we have survived. We've not only survived this past year, many of us have thrived together, and we all know that it's from working together, but also that technology was that glue that held everything together. And I need to make sure that what I continue to do is communicate with our users, and that these new lines of communication that have been open, these new tools that we've been using. I mean, January 2020, we're completely deployed with Microsoft Teams. We're all in from a solution perspective. Did everyone not know how to use it? No. By June 1, we are all proficient on these tools. And what was mentioned earlier, right, about how, what should have been an email is now a Slack, for us, that would be a Teams chat or something like that. I think that it's really important for us to look at all of these tools that we've started to use. Most of them we've used them very smartly. We haven't had a lot of sprawl because we haven't had the time for the nonsense, right? Like we have to stick to our channels or we lose those communications. We need to probably wrap some formal procedure around how we're using some of this stuff and really make sure that we spread it across the entire organization in a uniform way. Otherwise, the sprawl can happen again. Our success has been in remaining consistent through this whole process. And we just need to make sure, no, disaster recovery and business continuity plans of the past, like the worst case scenario is, we're going to have this back live within 30 days, maybe 60 days max. And then we may not even have a business after 60 days. A year and a half later, we've been in, business recovery mode. And so, I think that we just need to make sure that we document what has worked for us to make sure that we stay consistent.
Yeah, I mean, I like that image of winning the war. I don't even think it's much of an exaggeration, really. It really was that big a challenge. And in terms of the communication, it's so interesting. Some of the folks I work with, for us, it's Slack, and I'm amazed what I know about people in terms of their pets, their favorite ice cream. We all this is sort of like this digital life has become very much like the physical life, just as it used to be. Miles, what do you see in terms of trying to digitally engage employees and customers better in these days, which is so important during pandemic? I mean, what are some of the priorities and things that you think are really key in this area?
Well, we've talked a little bit about the employee side. I mean, I think the interesting question is how do we make it better? What's the next step like? I mean, certainly Slack and Teams have become, ways to communicate. We're still learning how to be collaborative, but we're finding that it works, and it's an interesting way. Instead of a long email thread that you have to go discover things, it's easier to discover it within Slack or Team. I think as well. I think the big thing is how do we engage customers, or in your world, how do we engage students and alumni and all that stuff effectively? And I think we're still figuring that part out. It's interesting in talking to our CMO. I've said, are we going to do a lot of online kinds of things? Are we going to get back to person? And it's going to be a different mix. And so then you have to find out how do we effectively engage all of those folks. So I think it's a big change, and it's going to be interesting to see, what initiatives become critical moving forward as CIOs. But it's clear to me the one big change is that we're talking more about the not back office things, but we're talking about the nature of how the business runs.
Yeah, and then there's also the idea of like we will actually come together physically at some point. You know, it's like goodness, like how do we do that? I'm not sure I know how to actually interface with people, live in a room. I'm gonna have to relearn that skill. It's a great skill from what I remember. Um, Isaac, what do you see in terms of digitally engaging employees and customers, and how can that be better, and what's important about that process?
Well, I think what we learned is how important we have to engage on really fast solutions, and really collaborative solutions on the on the internal side. How do you bring people who are subject matter experts, who understand customer, who understand technology and data together? If you look back during the pandemic, I mean, think about every small business is now calling up their bank for information on how to get a PPP loan. And some banks had the tools in place to engage customers, and some worked well, and some followed up with you on deadlines and what you needed to do. And some of them left customers frustrated, right? Not knowing what to do. And they start shopping around for other banks that could get them dollars faster. I think the same thing in retail, right? All of a sudden, you got inventory, people can't show up to your stores. How are you going to change the model so you're still engaging employees, so you still have a lifeline of business, and allow that to evolve through the ups and downs of what's happening pandemic wise? And we know that certain businesses thrived during that. Some of them pivoted dramatically. Others, we don't hear from them anymore. You see them closing stores up and they're not around anymore. So I think what someone said earlier, it's much easier to get investment. I think, or investment is really important. I think people are looking at their teams now and saying, how do we get the right people together to collaborate, knowing that speed is really important, that in some cases we can predict what's going to happen next. And a lot of times we can't fully predict what's going to happen. We can just have our teams ready. And, there's a white paper I did earlier in the pandemic that showed a couple of soccer players facing off each other, and you see them standing on their toes, ready to pounce on a ball, going from defense to offense. And I think that's the posture we're all trying to be. It's not just about having the laptops up and running, and not just about having VPNs up and running, or being able to respond to a customer issue when they go onto our chat bots. It's okay, is there a new opportunity here, or new supply chain issue here? How do we learn about it fast enough, and how do we recognize what are the right opportunities for our teams to really think through innovative solutions around?
Hmm. Jason, what advice would you give to companies in terms of digitally engaging employees and customers, which is so vital in the pandemic and is not going to get any less vital? What's important there?
You have to look back at the pandemic to see how it became the largest societal shift since World War II, greater and more impactful than, say, 9/11, right? Every part of our industry changed. I'm in the healthcare SaaS business. Let's think about how that changed for the end user, which would be patients, and the acceleration of telemedicine. You know, what became as a stopgap so people could safely interact with their doctor is quickly becoming a de facto way to see your doctor. So when we talk about post-pandemic, right, we accelerated to telehealth. Telehealth enabled people to interact with their doctors, get prescriptions refilled while the pandemic was going on. Now all of a sudden they thought, I live in Atlanta. Why the hell am I driving across town to go to Buckhead just to see my doctor for literally 2 minutes after I've waited in line or waited in the waiting room for 20 minutes just to get a prescription refilled? Why don't I pull out my phone, just say, hey, doc, we're going to schedule it this time. Just need a quick check-in. That way I can get my prescription refilled. All this has created a paradigm shift within the market. And it's not just healthcare, it's other industries, how you interact. Post-pandemic, are you still going to go in the grocery store every day when you have access to Instacart? Are you still going to go, maybe I'll go in a restaurant more, I just put the kids to bed. Why don't we order, Greek, and we'll go through DoorDash and order from down the street, or whoever it be. How we were doing things before has been so disrupted, and especially in our personal lives. We talked about healthcare. We talked about food delivery. We talked about grocery delivery. All this has changed. A lot of that's not going back. And so it required that CIOs understand not only did those changes occur during the pandemic, there'll be large paradigm shifts that affect our business going forward. And it might be those parts of the business we need to heavily invest to grow even more as people adapt to what will be whatever new norm is for consumption of that data.
You know, if we look back at COVID a few years from now, say we're in the year 2025, what will we see as having been changed forever? What will be the really big milestone, the way we look at things? Isaac, what do you forecast? What will COVID have changed forever a few years from now?
Well, I have a hope around this, that this notion of hybrid working really does stick, employees have gotten used to the idea of some autonomy, some choice. And there's a little bit of a divide going on right now, as you started, about, whether companies are going to require everybody to get back to the office, whether they're going to go the other extreme and say we're going to stay 100% remote and give employees complete flexibility. And there's a lot of gray area in between this. And people are trying to figure out what's important for them, what's important for their careers and their lifestyles. And, you're starting to see some surveys, 39% in one survey said that if their employers don't offer remote working capabilities, they're going to start looking for jobs.
Right.
I saw one article call it the Great Resignation, as a way of calling this period of people waking up and saying, you know what, I might get paid well, but I don't see what impact I'm making in my job. I don't align with the company's mission anymore. I'm going to go try to do something else. So I think that's going to be the most interesting thing. I don't know. My hope is that what will look different in 2 or 3 years is that we have a better balance between how companies and people are working together. And then we have better work-life balance.
That I'm not totally optimistic about, but I like the sound of that. Paige, what would you predict? I mean, if we look back at COVID a few years from now, what will have changed forever? And, what might be positive about that process, or maybe not so positive?
Well, I think, hopefully in 5 years, this is 5 years behind us, right? Like we don't know what's going to happen in 1 month, 2 months, 6 months. Will it repeat? Don't know.
Sure.
But I think based on something that Jason had said earlier, right? Like some of these gap fillers, right? I hope that rather than, we have set what's possibly an improvement for all of the individuals that we interact with from a business perspective. These gap fillers that came up, right? Like the remote work, the using the chat. I mean, all of these different alternatives, distance learning, that's always been a thing, but it's been sort of a side-eye thing, right? Less than face-to-face interaction. I hope that rather that we don't spend 2 years fighting this stuff, and that we just embrace it for an additional inclusive option that's out there. Remote everything, virtual everything is not for everyone, but it is for a lot of someone's. It's a dramatic improvement in just a lifestyle and mental health and wellness. I mean, it's just better for so many, and it's included with technology, right? Like we can facilitate all of this. If we don't remain really hybrid open, it's not because of the technology. It's because of all of the red tape that surrounds everything and weird decision making. Looking back on this, what I hope that we have in the future is a nonstop focus on like a rebirth of keep it simple, stupid, or, to where we recognize that every complexity that we bake in, every complexity that we allow to persist, makes it more difficult for us to pivot when we need to pivot. And that complexity is not a great thing, that we need to scale everything way down so that everything that we provide from the ground up, from a technology perspective, is just flat out plug and play and easy. Because the last thing that we want to be messing with ever again is that if we have to make some switches or changes or some pivots because of the environment or whatever, it's so easy when you can just flip one switch and stuff just works. So, that's what I am hoping, that when we look back on this, it's like, wow, we are looking at everything with a how can we pivot first mentality. And now we've all lived it. So we know the value in it, and we know that it could happen. So that's what I'm hoping that we walk away with.
You talked a little bit about, you hope there's not a resistance to this technology-enabled hybrid world. Do you think there will be? I don't necessarily
Yeah.
sense that at this point, but what is will there be resistance or not necessarily?
Absolutely. I mean, despite the fact that, across several companies and institutions that I'm aware of, there is a dramatic interest in being able to remain hybrid. And these numbers are up to like 80% wanting to remain hybrid. Upper management, we're back on prem. That's it, top down. Despite the fact that for the past 6 months, in order to help people cope and lessen anxiety, they've all said something along the lines of, we're going to be very respectful. We're going to support hybrid, all of this. I'm watching some of that tear down. And I think that all of these wonderful rainbow dreams of us being able to kind of walk that talk, I think that from a top-down perspective, that's going to change for more than a few.
Interesting. Okay. Miles, what do you see? Is that kind of a pipe dream that we keep with this hybrid work going, or and what will change? Say if we're mid 20s, what kind of change would you expect?
I think hybrid's going to continue. I think it's going to continue at rates that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't gone through the crisis. I mean, and look at myself. I went to work for a company that's undrivable in the Bay Area. And I said,
where is Elation's headquarters? I mean, like, you talk about Elation, it's undrivable to get to their headquarters?
Well, I live in Brentwood, and Brentwood to Redwood City is an impossible drive. And so I think it was in the first interview, I said, all right, you're going to take me remote, right?
Okay.
Said, yes, we'll take you remote.
Oh, good. All right. Yeah.
So I just think that pressure, one of the things I heard from experts a while back is that it's going to redefine the social contract between employers. So it's bigger than just hybrid. It's redefining what boundaries are and things like that. But I think the other thing for me that's big here is, we've talked a long time about digital transformation.
Right.
And I think every company has realized it's a digital company. And now it's about, okay, how do we win at being digital? In education, how do we make some kind of a hybrid experience work? And how do we effectively engage? I had students, by the way, Paige, who I didn't even know if they were attending while I was giving lecture. It was really hard, and I tried to make it more dynamic, but there were babies in the background because they were home. It was hard, but we've got to figure out, regardless of what kind of industry you're in, how do we make a digital world work and make it work for everybody, whether they're remote as a customer or employee or remote, on station. How are we going to work all those boundaries? That's going to be the thing that'll happen in the next 5 years, I think.
Jason, what do you forecast if we're several years out from now? We look back at COVID. Hopefully, we are looking back at it. It will totally recede. I mean, what kind of changes would you expect? And will this hybrid working world really survive?
Yeah, if the internet made every company a tech company, COVID will make every company a healthcare company. And part of healthcare is mental health and mental well-being. When we talk about the embrace of hybrid, right, for 18 months, right, we've proven it can work, right? Millions of organizations. There definitely seems to be, I'm going to say, almost a demarcation, almost an age, by the way. And this is not a scientific study, but what I've seen interacting with other CIOs and leaders. Above 50, let's get back to the office right away. Below 50, hybrid works, right? And so what we're going to see is that the users, people want, like I think Paige mentioned the quote, or it might have been Isaac, 80% of people want a hybrid approach. You know what? For the past 18 months, it's worked for them. They've been able to have lunch with their children. They've been able to go out and go check the mail or go take an afternoon jog, but still get their work done. And it worked for their mental health, especially in a pandemic. What companies have to realize is that as they evolve, they have to adapt to what are the needs of their employee base. Our employee base pre-pandemic 30+% was remote. Now it's fully remote. Going forward, we had dozens of offices. We've shuttered them. I've given up a corner office for a home office. Our headquarters in Pittsburgh. I live in Atlanta. Talk about a commute, Miles. I can't drive there every day, right? And so the idea is you also have to be making sure if you do adapt to a hybrid model that you're not creating two class of citizens, right? On-prem versus remote, right? And so leaders also have to lead by example. If you're a leader and you're in the office every day, guess what? You're already setting an example. You want to make sure that if you're creating these policies that work for your employees, that they also work for you and you're doing it as well. But I foresee there'll be a lot of organizations, many organizations that do 5 years from now, keep that hybrid model. And they're going to keep it because people want that. I won't even call it a work-life balance, a work-life harmony. They've got to figure out what works for them. Many are taking care of elderly parents while they're taking care of young children. And so sometimes that requires an hour or two of disruption during the day, and they need a job that actually balances that. And they're going to start demanding it because they've gotten it for 18 months.
And
Well,
that's where, like,
go ahead,
what
Paige, please.
what I was saying earlier, right? Like, I hope that we don't spend the next couple of years fighting this, right? I foresee that the next couple of years will be rough because there will be numerous industries that I think will try to bring everything back to quote unquote normal, whatever that is. And it's going to end up being a lot of wheel spinning and a lot of wasted time because employees have options now. They've experienced hybrid. They know it can work. Not having that drive time. Wow, how great is that? And there are options elsewhere, especially in those more traditional industries like education, right? Like employees have a choice. I can always go work for a tech company and make more than what I'm making now. And now you're going to throw in supporting me remotely. I mean, you send me a laptop on top of that, and that's a better deal than I've had in the past 15 years in higher ed, right? Like that's a benefit, that's a perk. And, I think that eventually those industries will sort of track along. And I just wish they wouldn't spend the next 2 years fighting it. But, I just feel like they probably will. That's just reality. We've got some deeply traditional industries out there.
But those that don't fight it will have a competitive advantage. They'll be able to attract talent nationwide or from anywhere else. It also gives a very great opportunity to increase diversity initiatives within an organization. As terrible as the pandemic has been, this has been the best thing in some ways for employees that are handicapped, right? They don't have to take the struggle of getting from home to office. And so they can go right to work with less physical impact and less physical strain on them because they have an opportunity at home where they set up an environment. And so I encourage those organizations to keep embracing that. Again, there's a diversity initiative that we can more easily accomplish in a remote world than we can in a traditional office setting.
Yeah, virtual absolutely fills in gaps. It absolutely bridges gaps for people.
And I think we have to keep touting this because the reality is during the digital age, we've had other big inflection points. We've had 2001, we've had 2008, now we have 2020. And, what you saw coming out of those events is when the dust started to clear and things started getting back to normal, some companies continued down the path of what they learned that they needed to change, and the others went back to the way things were. And when we talk about digital divides, right? Digital divides were created during those inflection points. So it's not surprising to me that in 2020, it was the tech companies in Seattle and San Francisco were the first companies to say work from home. They were all ready to do it. Yes, they had to get more people understanding how to use these technologies, but they had the technologies already available to them. And these are the first companies coming back and saying, you know what, we're going to find a way to work with our employees in a hybrid model. We're going to find a way to create a new collaborative model. We're going to be engaging in skills and staff in different parts of the world. We're going to be creating a more diverse workforce from JJ's point of view. That's going to happen there. And then you hear some, companies on Wall Street, for example, saying, you know what, their CEO saying, we're going to get everybody back in the office the This is a
Right.
passing notion. And I'm like, that's crazy, right? That is just a crazy thing to be telling your employees right now.
Well, if I could even speak up for the old guard, oddly enough, you would expect my better. But just for my in the world of, if say education page, what do you think? Because I hear all this stuff like, oh, this Zoom school, it's really bad, and we do need to get back in the classroom. And so it seems like in the education market in particular, there's a sense of this remote thing. We really don't like it. I mean, do you think education is alone in that sense?
I think that it's interesting that, in education, and it could possibly happen in other areas as well. You hear the complaints from the vocal minority. I mean, that's just the way that it is.
Mhm.
I think that it was maybe Jason that said it earlier about how working remotely in a pandemic is not the same as working remotely not in a
Right.
pandemic.
Right.
And it's the same with teaching, right? Like teaching online is not the same as just holding your class online. And the way that a lot of faculty members started out the fall semester, and even, God forbid, the summer semester of last year, like they were literally just trying to still be that sage on a stage
Hmm.
in front of a camera. And of course, that
Hmm.
doesn't work. It's not engaging. It's a completely different way of teaching.
Hmm.
I think that for some people, virtual learning isn't a fit, right? Like they
Right.
don't enjoy it. But
Right.
for so many students that have been traditionally on campus in residence halls, students, they were able to experience a hybrid environment, which gave them the freedom of choice, like an option. And I noticed this when I worked in Connecticut, that we did empower a hybrid learning environment, no matter who you were or where you were. And we may have 50% of our students on any given day decide they didn't want to get out in the snow or the sunshine and walk 10 feet across campus to the lecture hall. They wanted to
Okay.
kick back on their couch and
Hmm.
participate. And you know what? Why not? Why
Yeah.
not make that option? It doesn't cost anyone any more money. However, what it does do for that student engagement piece, it forces faculty to learn how to engage students that are both right there in front of them and sitting on their couches in their frat house, right?
Uh-huh. Right.
So, why in the world would we not be providing these options? It closes these gaps, it eliminates the anxiety for many, maybe not all, maybe not most, but for many. And in higher ed, you do hear people that still side eye the online learning and all
Mm,
that kind of
sure.
stuff, but that's
Yeah.
that's going away.
Hmm.
And that has normally been promoted by faculty members who think it's less than to deliver a degree that way. And now that they've been forced to teach online, they kind of love it. And so I see the tides in that changing as well as we move forward.
Interesting. Okay. Well,
I
it,
think, James,
please.
where we're
Yes.
going is that
Mhm.
the next step is going to require vision. So strategic
Mm.
CIOs are going to be really important. And it's now the game is how do we make this productive? Whether it's reconceiving how education's done or reconceiving how people get access to stuff, whatever it may be, the game now is how do we envision this actually working and being productive for a large percentage of employees?
Mm.
Here's
Now's the
one.
best time to do that. I mean, if you look at where we are in an inflection point, when would there be another time to look back and say, why wouldn't we change everything, right? People want to go back to normal. But just because it was normal doesn't mean it was good. uh, Sitting in a commute for 2 hours, what's good about that? How unproductive is that? It gives us a chance to work with a business in the same way we've always had laggers, no matter what company you're in. Well, we've always done it that way. These are these same leaders that want to go back to pre-pandemic because they've always done it that way. That shows a lack of vision. That shows a lack of leadership. We have a strong opportunity to say, how do we think the future should be designed, whether it be education, healthcare, or any other industry?
I think education and healthcare, let's go tackle the big mountains here. You think about, what's the cost to educate a college student or a K-12 student, and saying, over the next 5 years, we want to double the number of people going through these systems. We want the cost to go down by 50%, and we want to improve the experience. How can we do that? And we did not have a tool to do that with technology before the pandemic. It was a, a certain set of experience. It was hard. It was not personalized. The K-12 experience, I'm going to speak to it as a parent. It was difficult. You had some students who could thrive in a virtual environment. My kids struggled through it, and the technology, quite frankly, wasn't ready for a K-12 experience, and the teachers weren't ready and the students weren't ready. But we have a little bit more time now to figure this out, right? And we have a little bit more time to say, look, we need more kids coming out of programs, more innovative, more collaborative, more smarter, and spending less money on their education to do it. And we need more people teaching, right? We need more people being able to participate in those programs. How do we use this new set of tools and this new mindset to change the model? Same thing in healthcare. Could I use that as an example?
And once again, one of the things that I recognized that was the differentiator for success for us, Isaac, is that, my kids were in middle school and intermediate elementary, so 6th and 8th or something like that. They were remote all year. The difference in their success was the communication of their teacher, right? Like the ones that started out with, I have no idea what I'm doing, right? But we're going to lock arms and we're going to do this together. And that communication stayed persistent. Those were the successful courses for my kids, right? It was devoid of the technology that was available. It was keeping those lines of communication open so that you still had that connection to, I'm getting the support that I need. Our arms are locked. We're getting through this together. And that's what we should be doing the next 2 years in healthcare and education. Just keep moving forward, but make sure that everyone still feels that connection to us, like they're a part of something special, because really this is a special time.
And just on a personal note on that same subject of that, I worked remotely for many years, and every once in a while, if I'm feeling like, oh my God, my job is stressing me, I walk down the end of the street at the end of the day and I see that Highway 508. There's a long line of cars, like there's a mile of cars, people trying to get home. And I'm thinking, well, at least I don't have to do that. Maybe I should be happy with all the, everything that's going on at work. And on that note, Isaac, Paige, Jason, everyone else, thank you very much for joining us today. I definitely learned something.
Miles.
Appreciate your Miles. We have our senior moments, don't we? Thank you very much for sharing your expertise today. And I'll send you the link when it's done. All right.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
Bye-bye.